morning. Swami Medhananda is Senior Research Fellow in Philosophy at the Sri Ramakrishna Institute of Moral and Spiritual Education in Mysore, India. From 2010 to 2021, he was Assistant Professor and Head of Philosophy at the Ramakrishna Mission Vivekananda Educational and Research Institute in West Bengal, India. His current research focuses on Vedantic philosophical traditions, cross-cultural philosophy of religion, cross-cultural approaches to consciousness, Indian scriptural hermeneutics, and the philosophies of Sri Ramakrishna, Swami Medhananda, and Sri Aurobindo. He received his PhD from the University of California at Berkeley and also studied at Oxford University and Humboldt University in Berlin. He is the author of 3 books. The first, Swami Vivekananda's Vedantic Cosmopolitanism, published by Oxford University Press in 2022. The second, Infinite Paths to Infinite Reality, Sri Ramakrishna and Cross-Cultural Philosophy of Religion, Oxford University Press 2018. And the third, The Dialectics of Aesthetic Agency, Re-evaluating German Aesthetics from Kant to Adorno, published by Bloomsbury in 2013. He is also the editor of the Bloomsbury Research Handbook of Vedanta and co-editor with Benedict Paul Brock of Pantheism in Indian and Western Thought, Cosmopolitan Interventions, which is forthcoming, published by Routledge. He is also the editor of 2 special issues of the International Journal of Hindu Studies, Springer, one on Vedantic theodicies and one on Swami Medhananda as a cosmopolitan thinker. He has published over 30 articles in international peer-reviewed journals. He has been appointed recently to the Vedanta Society of Southern California in Hollywood, where he will move in mid-August. I am truly delighted to welcome amongst us Swami Medhananda. I have had the pleasure of interacting with him online in the past, but it's the first time that we had the occasion to meet. And thank you for visiting us and being amongst us, and we look forward to your presentation. So we have Swamiji's talk for about an hour, and then there will be questions and answers at the end.
Thank you so much to Devdik Ganguly for inviting me here today. Thank you all for attending, and I'd like to thank Vikas for setting up the technical side of things and setting up the PowerPoint. Can you hear me? Is it fine?
Raise it.
Audio. I think it's better now. Can everyone hear me? Yeah. And last but not least, I want to thank my uncle, Shobhajit Ghosh, who's sitting in the audience. I'm honored to have him. He played an important role in my spiritual life, and so it's a special honor that he's here today before I go back to the West. Thank you. So I'm speaking today on the topic of integral knowledge, a defense of Sri Aurobindo's new interpretation of Vijnana in the Bhagavad Gita. This presentation is based on an article that was published in 2015 in Philosophy East and West. I'll give the reference at the end of the presentation. So if you're interested in what I'm going to talk about today, then I would refer you to that more detailed article for a more rigorous discussion. So before I get into Sri Aurobindo's interpretation of the Gita, it's important I want to emphasize an important aspect of Sri Aurobindo's thought that I think has been neglected by most scholars. That is the influence of the life and teachings of Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda on Sri Aurobindo. So, Sri Aurobindo himself wrote in an essay in 1908 called Spirituality and Nationalism. He wrote as follows: Sri Ramakrishna was the last and greatest of all the avatars, for while others felt God in a single or limited aspect, he, Sri Ramakrishna, felt God, him, in his illimitable unity as the sum of an illimitable variety. In him, the spiritual experiences of the millions of saints who had gone before were renewed and united. Sri Ramakrishna gave to India the final message of Hinduism to the world. But the influence of Sri Ramakrishna went beyond just Sri Ramakrishna's teachings and the spiritual life that he led, Sri Aurobindo claimed to have received 3 messages on a mystical plane from Sri Ramakrishna in 1912. I'm not quoting that here because it'll take too much time, but one of the messages was, for instance, Sri Ramakrishna, he spoke to Sri Aurobindo in Bangla because they were both Bengali. He said, Aurobindo mundir koro, mundir koro. Aurobindo, create your own ashram. And there were 2 other messages as well. And in a 1912 letter, Sri Aurobindo writes to his disciple, remember also that we derive from Ramakrishna. For myself, it was Ramakrishna who personally came and first turned me to this yoga. Regarding Swami Medhananda, when Sri Aurobindo was in Alipur jail for about a year, he claims that Swami Medhananda came to him daily for about a fortnight. There's a nice exhibition going on now about that period in Sri Aurobindo's life, and this is discussed in that exhibition as well. Sri Aurobindo says in a 1912 letter, Vivekananda in the Alipur jail gave me the foundations of that knowledge which is the basis of our sadhana. And he says in a much later letter, dated 21st October 1934, my contact with him, Vivekananda, was in the jail when he was speaking with me for about 15 days, giving me the first insight into the intuition plane, not the intuitive mind, which is mental and not supramental, as the first opening to supermind. And in the specific context of Sri Aurobindo's approach to the Vedantic scriptures, he says something extremely significant in the essay Karma Yoga, dated 1909. He says the following: the word Vedanta is usually identified with the strict monism, Advaita Vedanta, and the peculiar theory of Maya established by the lofty and ascetic intellect of Shankara. But it is the Upanishads themselves and not Shankara's writings, the text and not the commentary, that are the authoritative scripture of the Vedanta. Shankara's, great and temporarily satisfying as it was, is still only one synthesis and interpretation of the Upanishads. There have been others in the past which have powerfully influenced the national mind, and there is no reason why there should not be a yet more perfect synthesis in the future. It is such a synthesis, embracing all life and action in its scope, that the teachings of Sri Ramakrishna and Vivekananda have been preparing. So I think this is a very significant passage where Sri Aurobindo, at a very early point in his life, 1909, before he wrote any published commentaries on the scriptures, he says, it's time for a new interpretation of the Vedantic scriptures. Let's not rely any longer on the traditional commentators like Shankara. It's time to reinterpret the scriptures in the light of the teachings of Sri Ramakrishna and Vivekananda. Now, the question I think is worth exploring is, what teachings of Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda did he have in mind? And I would suggest that one of the main teachings of Sri Ramakrishna, from which Sri Aurobindo learned and by which he was influenced, was Sri Ramakrishna's teachings on Vijnana, what he called Vijnana. So this is how Sri Ramakrishna describes the spiritual stages of Jnana and Vijnana. He says, this is from the Kautamrita, translated as the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. He says, the Jnani gives up his identification with worldly things, discriminating not this, neti, neti. Only then can he realize Brahman. It is like reaching the roof of a house by leaving the steps behind one by one. But the Vijnani, who is more intimately acquainted with Brahman, realizes something more. He realizes that the steps are made of the same materials as the roof, bricks, lime, and brick dust. That which is realized as Brahman through the eliminating process of neti, neti, is then found to have become the universe and all its living beings. The Vijnani sees that the reality which is nirguna, impersonal, attributeless, is also saguna, personal, with attributes. A man cannot live on the roof for a long time. He comes down again. Those who realize Brahman in Samadhi come down also and find that it is Brahman that has become the universe and its living beings. This is known as Vijnana. So, according to Sri Ramakrishna, The Jnani is the Advaita Vedantam in the Shankarite sense, who attains spiritual realization of the impersonal, non-dual Brahman, Nirguna Brahman, through the practice of neti-neti discrimination. Brahman is not this, Brahman is not that. However, the Vijnani goes beyond the Advaita Jnani by realizing that Brahman is not only impersonal, Nirguna, but also personal, Saguna. So the Vijnani first attains Advaita Jnana, Brahma Jnana. Then he comes back down from the state of Samadhi and sees everything as God. On the basis of his own spiritual experience of Vijnana, Sri Ramakrishna taught that, this is one of his most famous teachings, Brahman and Shakti are inseparable. Brahma Shakti Abhed. And by Brahman, he's thinking of Nirguna Brahman, of Advaita Vedanta. And Shakti as the personal God, who creates, preserves, and destroys the universe. And he says that the Vijnani sees that it is Shakti, the personal aspect of the impersonal, personal, infinite reality, that has become everything in the universe. So while the Jnani dismisses the universe as what he calls Bhogatati, a framework of illusion, Shankara says Jagat Mithya. The Vijnani embraces the universe as a mansion of mirth. The Bangla here is Mojarpudi, since he sees that there's nothing in the universe but God. Now, we can come to Sri Aurobindo. Sri Aurobindo was not just influenced by Sri Ramakrishna's teachings at an intellectual level, he himself had the experiences of what Sri Ramakrishna called Jnana and Vijnana. So in January 1908, under the spiritual guidance of the yogi Vishnu Bhaskar Lele, Sri Aurobindo had what he calls a series of tremendously powerful experiences, which made him see with a stupendous intensity the world as a cinematographic play of vacant forms in the impersonal universality of the absolute Brahman. As Sri Aurobindo himself confirmed, this early experience was none other than Advaita Brahmagyan, which led him, like Sri Ramakrishna's Jnani, to look upon the world as an illusion. Jagat Mithya, Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya. But that was only his first experience. A few months later, he was incarcerated for a year in Alipur jail, and he intensely practiced the teachings of the Gita. And as I already mentioned, Vivekananda visited him for a fortnight. His sadhanas in the jail culminated in what I take to be the experience of Vijnana, because he explicitly describes his experience as seeing everything as God. So this is what Sri Aurobindo says. It's a famous passage, but I'll just repeat it. I looked at the jail that secluded me from men, and it was no longer by its high walls that I was imprisoned. No, it was Vasudeva who surrounded me. I walked under the branches of the tree in front of my cell, but it was not the tree. I knew it was Vasudeva. It was Sri Krishna whom I saw standing there and holding over me his shade. I looked at the bars of my cell, the very grating that did duty for a door, and again I saw Vasudeva. It was Narayana who was guarding and standing sentry over me. Or I lay on the coarse blankets that were given me for a couch and felt the arms of Sri Krishna around me, the arms of my friend and lover. This was the first use of the deeper vision he gave me. I looked at the prisoners in the jail, the thieves, the murderers, the swindlers, and as I looked at them, I saw Vasudeva. It was Narayana, whom I found in these darkened souls and misused bodies. So just as Sri Ramakrishna taught that the Vijnani sees that Brahman has become the 24 cosmic principles. In Bangla he said, Vijnani dekhe Brahmoi Choturbinshati Tattva hoyeche, Choturbinshati Tattva, the 24 cosmic principles. It seems to me that Sri Aurobindo had very much like this kind of experience of Vijnana in the Alipur jail. And of course, in later works like Savitri, he talks about it as cosmic consciousness and in other terms as well. Now we can get to his essays on the Gita, a monumental work on the Bhagavad Gita, which I think is underappreciated by scholars. And so part of the point of this presentation is to vindicate, to a certain extent, Sri Aurobindo's interpretation and really make a case for its contemporary value and significance. So he wrote this text from 1916 to 1920, and he substantially revised the text at two times, in 1922 and later in 1928. And as I just mentioned, most scholars have ignored Sri Aurobindo's essays on the Gita, and we might ask why. And I think one of the main reasons why most scholars don't take Sri Aurobindo's commentary seriously is that they tend to assume that because he was a mystic and a yogi, that he sort of read his own spiritual experiences into the Gita, rather than trying to understand the Gita on its own terms. Just to give you one example, Robert Minor, who was a prominent scholar of Sri Aurobindo, he wrote in 1986 that Sri Aurobindo took his own mystical experiences as, quote, the highest authority and the first interpretive principle, end quote, for understanding the Indian scriptures, including the Gita. Now, I don't completely disagree with Robert Minor. Obviously, Sri Aurobindo's spiritual experiences played a crucial role in how he interpreted the Vedantic scriptures, the Bhagavad Gita, the Upanishads. However, we should not jump to the conclusion that because he was basing his interpretation to some extent on his spiritual experiences, that therefore it's a kind of subjective, merely subjective interpretation that is reading his own experiences into the text. Rather, this is what I challenge. Minor's simplistic assumption that Sri Aurobindo's first interpretive principle is his own spiritual experience hardly does justice to the hermeneutic subtlety and sophistication of Sri Aurobindo's project in Essays in the Gita. One thing that's very significant, I think, is that in the 600-page text, Sri Aurobindo never once refers to his own spiritual experiences. So that should give us a clue, first of all, that even though he had many kinds of spiritual experiences, that's not what is foregrounding in his interpretation. He's trying his best to be as immanent to the scripture as possible. Immanent, I-M-M-A-N-E-N-T, which means internal to the text itself. What Minor ignores is Sri Aurobindo's conscious attempt to avoid eisegesis. This is a technical term used in scholarship on religious scriptures. Eisegesis is the opposite of exegesis in a technical sense. So exegesis means, in the technical sense, you're explaining what's really in the text. And eisegesis is exactly the opposite. Eisegesis is the practice of reading your own views into the text, kind of imposing your own ideas and frameworks onto the text, rather than letting the text speak for itself. So what Minor ignores is Sri Aurobindo's conscious attempt to avoid eisegesis and to understand the Gita's philosophy on its own terms. And I want to make the case that Sri Aurobindo's spiritual experiences, far from serving as the basis for eisegesis, for this kind of subjective interpretation, in fact, led him to adopt a rigorously immanent hermeneutic approach to the Gita that deserves to be recognized as a watershed in Gita scholarship. In particular, his spiritual experiences, especially the one under Oscar Lele in 1908 and then in 1909 in the jail, the Vijnana experience, as well as Sri Ramakrishna's teachings on Vijnana, attuned Sri Aurobindo to the centrality of the concept of Vijnana in the Bhagavad Gita, which Sri Aurobindo identified as the hermeneutic key to elucidating the Gita's entire thought structure. So he saw this concept of Vijnana as not just one concept among others, but as a kind of central concept that helps to explain all of the other concepts in the Gita. So now we get to the Gita. Jnana and Vijnana in the Gita. At 5 places in the Gita, 3.41, 6.8, 7.2, 9.1, and 18.42, the term Jnana is paired with the term Vijnana, hence raising the question of the precise distinction between the two terms. And many scholars have wrestled with what exactly Krishna meant by Jnana, what did he mean by Vijnana, what exactly is the difference between Jnana and Vijnana. In 341, for instance, Krishna describes desire, Kama, as the destroyer of Jnana and Vijnana, Jnana Vijnana Nashanam. And in 9.1, Krishna promises to impart to Arjuna, quote, Jnana combined with Vijnana, Jnanam Vijnana Sahitam. The Sanskrit prefix, the upasarga V, typically functions as an intensifier. Etymologically then, Vijnana would mean a deeper or more comprehensive form of knowledge than Jnana. But now we come to, so what I'm going to do with respect to different shlokas in the Gita is compare Shankara's interpretations with Sri Aurobindo's and argue for the greater plausibility and coherence of Sri Aurobindo's interpretations. So first, Shankara. How does he interpret Jnana and Vijnana in the Gita? So the issue is that if we interpret Vijnana in the Gita as a deeper or more comprehensive form of knowledge, this poses a problem for Shankara. Since Shankara's Advaita philosophy does not admit the possibility of a knowledge superior to Atmajnana. Atmajnana is the highest knowledge. There's nothing beyond that, according to Shankara. Atmajnana meaning knowledge of the impersonal, non-dual Atman. Hence, in his commentary on those verses in the Gita that distinguish between Jnana and Vijnana, those 5 places that I mentioned in the previous slide, Shankara glosses jnana as mere intellectual understanding of the self, and Vijnana as full-blown spiritual realization of the self. In his commentary on chapter 3, sloka 41, for instance, Shankara defines jnana as theoretical knowledge about the self, quote, derived from the scriptures and a teacher, so mere scriptural knowledge of spiritual truths. While he defines Vijnana as the full experience of that knowledge, visheshataha tad anubhava. And Shankara's interpretation of jnana and Vijnana seems to me to be what might be called the mainstream interpretation of jnana and Vijnana in the Gita. If you anecdotally ask somebody who doesn't necessarily follow a particular school, they might just read some version of the Gita, and you ask them, what does Krishna mean by jnana and Vijnana? 9 times out of 10, I've found, at least in my experience, that they say, yeah, jnana means scriptural knowledge of the Atman. Vijnana means spiritual knowledge, spiritual experience. So it's a very, very pervasive interpretation. Shankara's interpretation has strongly influenced contemporary interpretations. And I'm going to argue against that using Sri Aurobindo's interpretation. And to begin to challenge Shankara's interpretation, I want to point out 3 problems I see with Shankara's interpretation. The first is that the internal evidence in favor of Shankara's interpretation of the terms jnana and Vijnana is slim. What I mean is, there doesn't seem to be any evidence in the shlokas of the Gita themselves that jnana means merely scriptural knowledge, and Vijnana is full-blown spiritual experience. I don't see Shankara giving that kind of evidence from the text itself. Second, he fails to provide a convincing rationale for interpreting jnana as scriptural knowledge at certain places, such as in 3.41, and as complete spiritual realization of the Atman in many other places, like in chapter 4, sloka 39. So the thing is, Shankara is not consistent in the way that he interprets jnana in the different chapters of the Gita. There are many places in the Gita where Shankara himself will say that jnana is not just scriptural knowledge, it's actually spiritual realization. So in these contexts, when jnana is paired with Vijnana, why does Shankara suddenly pull back and say that jnana is not actually spiritual realization, it's just scriptural knowledge, Vijnana is a spiritual realization? So that's the second problem I see with it. The third problem, and most fundamentally, Shankara leaves himself open to the charge of eisegesis, since his Advaitic bias leads him to foreclose summarily the possibility that Vijnana is actually a greater and more comprehensive form of spiritual realization than realization of the impersonal, non-dual Atman. So now we can compare Sri Aurobindo's interpretation of jnana and Vijnana with Shankara's, and we can focus on, for starters, chapter 7, shloka 2, which goes as follows. This is in Sri Aurobindo's translation. Bhagavan Krishna tells Arjuna, I will speak to thee without omission or remainder, asheshataha. The essential knowledge, notice Sri Aurobindo's translation of jnana as essential knowledge, attended with all the comprehensive knowledge, Vijnana, by knowing which there shall be no other thing here left to be known. Jnanam teham savijnanam idam vaksham yasheshataha yaj jnatva nehamuyo yaj jnatavyam avashishyate. Sri Aurobindo interprets jnana as the essential knowledge of the impersonal, non-dual Atman. So Shankara's highest form of knowledge. But he interprets Vijnana as the more comprehensive knowledge that, quote, the divine being is all. These page numbers are from the complete works. The knowledge of God as the impersonal, personal, divine being who has become everything in the universe. Again, there might be an objection, like along the lines of Robert Minor that I mentioned earlier. How do we know that Sri Aurobindo is not just reading his own spiritual experiences and Sri Ramakrishna's teachings on Vijnana, for instance, into the Bhagavad Gita? A careful reading of Sri Aurobindo's essays on the Gita, however, will reveal that Sri Aurobindo provides what I would call an immanent contextual justification of his interpretation of Vijnana in the Gita. In fact, one of Sri Aurobindo's most original and significant insights into the Gita is his recognition that the concept of Vijnana, when properly understood, is the hermeneutic key to understanding the Gita's thought structure as a whole. The Gita is a text of 700 slokas and 18 chapters, and Sri Aurobindo thought that if you study the whole 600-page essay on the Gita, you'll find that Vijnana comes up in many different contexts, and it's a kind of master concept that explains other concepts in the Bhagavad Gita throughout the text. And Sri Aurobindo's general interpretive strategy throughout the essays of the Gita is not to just read his own spiritual experiences into the scripture but to determine the meaning of a given term on the basis of its broader context. So he always tries to anchor his interpretations of different terms in the Gita on the basis of context. And what do I mean by context? The surrounding shlokas, but also more generally, he kind of like broadens the context to the point where he tries to explain the Gita as a whole. And so his understanding of Vijnana in a certain shloka can only be understood if you read the entire essays on the Gita. So in a certain sense, his full justification for his interpretation of Jnana and Vijnana is his 600-page commentary. You can't selectively focus on certain aspects of his book and ignore the others. It's a fully contextual justification for his understanding of Vijnana. So let's begin to understand his contextual justification of Vijnana by looking at the preceding shloka. So I just recited to you 7.2. But let's go back to his interpretation of the previous shloka, 7.1. Sri Aurobindo first shows that his interpretation of Vijnana in 7.2 as comprehensive knowledge coheres well with the surrounding verses, 7.1 and 7.3, the subsequent verse. In 7.1, Arjuna is assured by Krishna that by taking refuge in Krishna, he will know Krishna samagra, which means fully or integrally. Maya saktamana pata yogam yunjan madashaya asamshayam samagram mam yatha nyasasi tatranu. So this word samagram is very significant for Sri Aurobindo because he interprets it as fully or integrally. And he's saying that, so the integral knowledge of God mentioned in 7.1, the samagram jnana, provides a crucial clue to the meaning of Vijnana in the very next shloka, in 7.2. Whereas jnana is knowledge of the impersonal Atma, Vijnana is a more comprehensive knowledge of the impersonal personal God. And he goes on with this contextual justification by looking at 7.3. His interpretation of Vijnana as comprehensive knowledge also helps account for Krishna's somewhat cryptic statement in 7.3, which has taxed the interpretive ingenuity of commentaries throughout the centuries. What's so puzzling about the shloka? Let's first look at the shloka and then we can talk about it. This is Sri Aurobindo's translation of 7.3. Among thousands of men, one here and there strives after perfection. And of those who strive and attain to perfection, one here and there knows me in all the principles of my existence. Tattvataha. Manushanam sahasreshu kaschid yatati siddhai. Yatatam api siddhanam kaschin mam veti tattvataha. So the really important words here are siddhanam and tattvataha. What's puzzling prima facie about this is that this shloka seems to assert that the attainment of perfection, siddhi, is not tantamount to achieving the summum bonum of full knowledge of God. So what do I mean? Look at the second line again. Yatatam api siddhanam kaschin mam veti tattvataha. It would be more sort of prima facie plausible or intuitive to say, and even among those who are striving to realize me, only a tiny minority actually realize me. But that's not what Krishna seems to be saying. What he's saying is, even among the perfected ones, only a few realize me tattvata, in all the principles of my existence. So Krishna seems to be suggesting that there are two stages in spiritual perfection. There's a lower siddhi and then the higher siddhi. Faced with this puzzle, Shankara denies the natural reading of yatatam siddhanam, of those who strive and attain to perfection. Siddhanam means siddhas. They're actually siddhas. They're perfected already, which clearly refers to those who have not only strived for perfection, but have actually attained perfection. Shankara claims that the so-called perfection, the siddhi of these strivers, is not to be taken literally, should not be taken at face value. According to Shankara, these people are called perfect, not only in the weak sense that they are striving for perfection, even though they have not yet attained full-blown perfection. So he's really militating against the natural reading of siddhanam here. He doesn't take it to mean perfected. On the basis of this questionable reading, Shankara goes on to assume that full or comprehensive knowledge, that's how he's interpreting the term tattvata. The comprehensive knowledge of God is simply atmagyan, the realization of the non-dual Atma. So Shankara says, the highest knowledge is knowledge of the impersonal non-dual Brahman. There's nothing higher than that. And therefore, when Krishna is talking about the siddhanam, they're not actually siddha. They're on their way to perfection. As a result of his Advaitic bias, Shankara not only weakens the meaning of the word perfection, the Siddhana in 7.3, but also denies the force of Tattvata, which suggests that the highest spiritual perfection consists not merely in the knowledge of the impersonal, non-dual Atman, but in the knowledge of the impersonal, personal God in all of his fullness, in all of his principles. And what I would argue is that Sri Aurobindo's reading of 7.3 is not only far more convincing than Shankara's, but also shows how Shloka 3 in chapter 7 flows naturally from the first and second shlokas. Unlike Shankara, Sri Aurobindo takes 7.3 literally. Even among those strivers who have actually attained perfection, only a few achieve what he calls integral knowledge of God. Hence the title of my talk, Integral Knowledge. Sri Aurobindo is the first commentator to recognize that the notion of knowing God tattvata, which he renders as knowing God in all the principles of his existence, refers back to the integral, samagram knowledge of God in the first sloka of chapter 7, and to the comprehensive knowledge of God, Vijnana, the term Vijnana, in the second shloka of chapter 7. But he doesn't stop there. So before I go on, so his contextual approach allows him to honor the crucial distinction Krishna draws in the third sloka of chapter 7 between two stages of spiritual perfection. From Sri Aurobindo's perspective, the strivers, Yatatamapi Siddhana, referred to in the second line of 7.3, have indeed attained the perfection of Atmagyana, the Shankarite knowledge of the non-dual Atman. But only a tiny minority of those jnanis go on to attain the greater perfection of Vidya, the integral or comprehensive knowledge of the impersonal, personal God. According to Sri Aurobindo's paraphrase of 7.3, Vijnana, what he calls the integral knowledge of God, is a rare and difficult thing, even rarer than Advaita Atmagyana. Now, as I said before, he doesn't stop there with just giving a contextual justification of his interpretation of Vijnana in 7.2 by referring to 7.1 and 7.3. He then broadens out and claims that all of the central concepts in the Bhagavad Gita, especially in the later chapters, after chapter 7, depend on the master concept of Vijnana. And I want to just give you two examples because I have limited time here. I want to focus on 3 shlokas from chapter 15, the doctrine of the Purushottama in the Gita, and 4 shlokas from chapter 18. So let's look at chapter 15, shlokas 16 through 18. Sri Aurobindo's translation. There are these two persons in the world, the perishable, Kshara, and the imperishable, Akshara. The perishable is all beings. The unchanging is called the imperishable. Dvavimau purusho loke, Ksharaschakshara evacha. Ksharas sarvani bhutani, bhutasto ksharuchate. But other than these two is the supreme person who is called the supreme Atman, who enters the 3 worlds and upholds them, the imperishable Lord. Uttamah purushastvanyaha paramatmeti dadataha, yo lokatrayamavesha vivattavi ishvaraha. Since I am beyond the perishable and above even the imperishable, this is a very important phrase, and above even the Akshara, I am known in the world and in the Vedas as the supreme person, Purushottama. Yasmad ksharam atitoham aksharad apichottamaha atosmi loke vedecha pratitaf purushottamaha. This is the Gita's most explicit and unambiguous statement that God, understood as the Purushottama, is even greater than the imperishable Akshara, Atman. The term Akshara, which occurs frequently in the Gita, refers almost invariably to the impersonal Atman. As in, just to give you 4 examples, 8.11, 8.21, 12.1, and 12.3. In 15.16, Akshara is defined as the unchanging, the Kutastha, a term used also in chapter 12, shloka 3, to refer to the imperishable Atman. So it's reasonable to assume from the context that Akshara is being used in the sense of the imperishable Atman in chapter 15, shloka 16, and in shloka 18 of chapter 15. I'm just giving a kind of intuitive reading first. However, now let's look at how Shankara interprets these problematic shlokas. Problematic from his standpoint, because he was an Advaita. Shankara interprets Akshara in 15.16 and 15.18 as not as the impersonal Atman, but as Maya, the seed of the mutable universe, despite interpreting Akshara in many other places in the Gita, like in chapter 12, shloka 1 and chapter 12, shloka 3, as the immutable Atman. So again, you find an inconsistency in the way that he's interpreting certain terms in the Gita. On Shankara's reading then, the Purushottama is the impersonal Atma, beyond the Akshara, which in this context he takes to mean Maya, and not the Atma. As the scholar T.G. Mainkar pointed out, Shankara adopts this pretty implausible reading of Akshara in chapter 15, shlokas 16 and 18, as a result of his commitment to the philosophy of Advaita Vedanta, which denies that there is anything superior to the Atman. In fact, Shankara says that's the only reality. The impersonal, non-dual Atman is the only reality. There's no question of something being higher than that. Now we can get to Sri Aurobindo's interpretation of the Purushottama doctrine in chapter 15 and how it compares with Shankara's. I think Sri Aurobindo more plausibly interprets Shara in 1516 and 1518 as the totality of the mutable universe, and Akshara as the full-blown impersonal Atma, what he calls the immutable self of all. Although the Kshara and the Akshara may seem to be irreconcilable opposites, Sri Aurobindo claims that the highest spiritual experience of Vijnana reveals that, quote, these two spirits, meaning Kshara and Akshara, are a dual status of one eternal and universal existence, which the Gita here refers to as the Purushottama. By attaining jnana, we realize the impersonal Atman, the immutable Akshara aspect of the Purushottama. When we ascend from jnana to Vijnana, however, we realize the higher and more comprehensive truth that the Purushottama is not only the supreme Atman, the term used in 1517, the Akshara beyond the universe, but also Abhyaya Ishvara, the imperishable Lord, Shloka 17, who both rules over and pervades the Kshara, the domain of the phenomenal universe. So the Purushottama is both personal and impersonal on Sri Aurobindo's reading. The Vijnani attains the integral knowledge of God as the impersonal personal Purushottama, who is, quote, more even than a highest unmanifest Akshara, more than any negative absolute, because he is to be known also as the supreme Purusha, who extends this whole universe in his own existence. For Sri Aurobindo then, the concept of Vijnana is the key to understanding how the Gita can maintain without contradiction that God is at once the impersonal Atman, the Akshara, and the Lord of all the worlds, Abhyaya Ishvara, at once the transcendent Brahman and the immanent divine pervading the entire universe. And finally, I wanted to focus on a really fascinating set of shlokas from chapter 18, shlokas 53 to 56. Perhaps the single strongest piece of evidence in favor of Sri Aurobindo's radical reinterpretation of Vijnana in the Gita is this passage from chapter 18, which I think clearly distinguishes two fundamental stages in spiritual experience that correspond perfectly to Sri Ramakrishna's and Sri Aurobindo's notions of jnana and Vijnana. So, Shloka 53. Having put away egoism, violence, arrogance, desire, wrath, the sense and instinct of possession, free from all I-ness and minus, calm and luminously impassive, one is fit to become the Brahman. Ahankaram, balam darpam, kamam krodham parigraham, vimuccha nirmama shanto brahma bhuyaya padate. When one has become Brahman and has attained the serene Atman, when one neither grieves nor desires and is the same toward all beings, then one attains supreme devotion to me. Brahma bhuta prasannatman shochati nakamshati samas sarveshu bhuteshu mad bhaktim lavate param. Then you get the bhakti. Through devotion, again bhaktiyama, that person knows me, who and how much I am, and in all the reality and principles of my being. Then, having known me comprehensively, one enters into that. Bhaktya mam abhijanati yavan yashchasmi tattvataha tato mam tattvato gyatva vishate tadarantaram. Notice the word tattvataha coming up again. We should remember, keen audience members will remember that term tattvataha comes up in 7.3 as well. And then, 66, even while continuing always to perform all actions and resorting to me, Krishna, as refuge, one attains by my grace the eternal and imperishable state. Sarva karmani apisada kurvano mad vipashayaha mad prasadat avapnoti shashvatam padamabhyam. These are the shlokas. Now, let's look first at Shankara's interpretation of these shlokas. Shankara, now, see, in certain places, Swami Medhananda points out that traditional commentators like Shankara tortured the scriptures at certain times. He used strong language. He used the word tortured. They tortured the scriptures to suit their own philosophies. And in another place, in the Inspired Talks, Swami Medhananda said that Shankara, Ramanuja, and all of the traditional acharyas were at times conscious liars. So in Bangla we say Kwara Bhasha. He's using very strong language to criticize them. I think, again, when Sri Aurobindo mentioned that the teachings of Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda are preparing us for a new interpretation of the Vedantic scriptures, I think this aspect of Swami Vivekananda's teachings might have influenced Sri Aurobindo. Because this is one of the keynotes of Swami Vivekananda's approach to the scriptures. He said, we should no longer blindly rely on the traditional commentators because they sometimes torture the scriptures. We need to reinterpret the Vedantic scriptures in a new light. So this is, I think, a pretty flagrant example of Shankara's text torture. Shankara interprets the word bhakti in Shloka 54 and 55 as jnana. I mean, it's literally like the opposite of what bhakti means. Knowledge of the non-dual Atma. So he doesn't interpret bhakti as devotion at all. And then Shankara interprets me, Mam, Krishna referring to himself. He interprets Krishna as non-dual consciousness. Advaitam Chaitanya Matra Ekarasam. So according to Shankara, while Shlokas 54 to 55, chapter 18, refer to the highest Advaitic jnana, the next shloka, 56, refers to the inferior aspirant, what he calls the Manda Adhikari, who becomes eligible to practice jnana yoga eventually, gradually, through the practice of bhakti-oriented karma yoga. So for Shankara, bhakti yoga and karma yoga in the Gita are almost used as synonyms. So this is Shankara's framework. I'm an inferior spiritual aspirant, so therefore I'm not fit to practice jnana yoga. I practice bhakti yoga and karma yoga. Gradually, probably in the course of many lives, I become eligible finally to practice jnana yoga when my mind becomes sufficiently pure. I attain what's called jnana nishtha yogyata, eligibility to practice jnana yoga. Then I stop practicing bhakti, I stop practicing karma yoga, and I only practice jnana yoga. And then I realize jnana. I attain jnana, and I attain the goal of life, which is liberation. For those of you who are familiar with Sri Aurobindo's interpretation of the Ishopanishad, his great commentary, this should remind us of Shankara's appeal to Adhikari Bheda in his interpretation of the first and second mantras of the Ishopanishad. So, according to Shankara, the first verse, Isha Vasamidam Salvam Yatkincha Jagatyam Jagat Tena Tyaktena Bhunjita Magrita Kasyasvidharam, is for superior spiritual aspirants who are fit for jnana, who are jnanis. The next mantra poses a big problem for Shankara. Kurvan neveha karmani, jije vishekshataga samaha. Continuing to act in this world, one should strive to live for 100 years. This is very difficult for Shankara to explain. So if the previous shloka was meant for jnanis, jnana yogis, who are supposed to have renounced the world and give up this body, why is the Upanishad in the very next shloka saying that you should continue to act in this world? So what Shankara does is he brings in Adhikari Bheda, and he says the second mantra is for inferior aspirants who are only eligible for karma yoga. And Sri Aurobindo has a field day with this in his commentary on Isha Upanishad, and he explicitly criticizes Shankara for arbitrarily bringing in, not arbitrarily, strategically bringing in the Adhikari Bheda to explain the difference between the first and second mantras. So I think something similar structurally is going on here in these shlokas from chapter 18 of the Bhagavad Gita. You get Bhagavan Krishna talking first about the need to attain jnana, Brahma Bhuta, becoming one with Brahma. Then he says you attain Parabhakti, supreme devotion to Krishna, the Purushottama. Then he says Sarva Karmani Api Sada, continue to act in this world as a Vijnana. And so Shankara, so I think that's enough. At least it can be, I don't find Shankara's interpretation convincing because there's no internal evidence in the Gita or in the Ishopanishad for that matter that certain slokas refer to superior aspirants and other slokas refer to inferior aspirants. That's what I see as the main weakness in Shankara's interpretation. Now we can come to Sri Aurobindo's interpretation of the same shlokas. According to Sri Aurobindo, these pregnant verses contain what he calls all the kernel of the complete yoga of the Gita. The special yoga described in these verses encompasses what he calls a double realization that can only be understood on the basis of the Gita's key distinction between jnana and vijnana. So again, this vijnana concept comes in. The first essential stage of spiritual experience is embodied in Shloka 54 of chapter 18, By eradicating all egoism, ahankara, one becomes Brahma, Brahmabhuta, in the sense of attaining jnana. This is Shankara's Advaita Jnana, the realization of what Sri Aurobindo calls the serene Atman. Sri Aurobindo says to lose ego and be this impersonal self, to become this impersonal Brahman in our consciousness, is therefore the first movement of this yoga. The first, but not the final movement. Then, verses 55 and 56 proceed to describe the spiritual ascent from jnana to a still greater and more comprehensive realization. After realizing the impersonal Atman, the jnani goes on to attain param bhaktim, supreme devotion towards Krishna. This is Shloka 54. For Sri Aurobindo, the supreme spiritual ideal taught in the Gita is not jnana, as Shankara claims, but bhakti, albeit a special form of supreme bhakti rooted in the prior attainment of jnana. This supreme bhakti is none other than Vijnana, the integral knowledge of the impersonal person of Purushottama pervading the universe. Sri Aurobindo says, here there is given to us something yet higher than the impersonal. Here there is the supreme self, who is the supreme Ishvara. Here there is the supreme soul and its supreme nature. Here there is the Purushottama, who is beyond the personal and impersonal. He's recalling chapter 15, slokas 16 through 18, and reconciles them on his eternal heights. By ascending from jnana to vijnana, one realizes the supreme secret that God is the infinite Purushottama, who is not only the impersonal Atman, but also the personal Lord, dwelling in the hearts of all creatures, as well as the divine spirit, pervading the entire universe. In stark contrast to Shankara, Sri Aurobindo interprets Shloka 56 as following naturally and sequentially from the previous two shlokas. The Vijnani continues to perform all actions, sarva karmani abhisada, as a perfect instrument of the divine Purushottama. The Vijnani acts, quote, for the sake of the divine in the world. So he's already a perfected soul. He doesn't need to do work in the world for chitta shuddhi, for perfection, for purification of the mind. He does it for the sake of God, for the good of all beings, for the fulfillment of the world action and the world purpose. Or in one word, for the sake of the Purushottama, and done really by him through his universal Shakti. Taken together, shlokas 54 to 56, according to Sri Aurobindo, indicate that the integral realization of Vijnana involves nothing less than a perfect synthesis of knowledge, jnana, devotion, bhakti, and selfless action, karma yoga. Now, I want to briefly discuss in just 2 slides, and then I'm going to wrap it up, some of the implications of Sri Aurobindo's new interpretation of Vijnana for sadhana, for spiritual practice. According to Sri Aurobindo, the Vijnani's integral turning of the soul Godwards bases royally the Gita's synthesis of knowledge and works and devotion. So this is a direct quotation from Essays on the Gita. Sri Aurobindo himself is drawing a direct link between his new interpretation of Vijnana, Purushottama, the different stages of spiritual realization, and spiritual practice, sadhana. So according to Sri Aurobindo, the Gita holds up the Vijnani as the ideal embodiment of the synthesis of jnana, karma, and bhakti that all sadhakas and sadhikas should strive to emulate. We might call what Sri Aurobindo calls the triune path taught in the Gita Vijnana Yoga. That's my term. Since the essence of this threefold yoga is to strive to see and act in the universe precisely as the Vijnani would see and act in. Let's strive to emulate the Vijnana. In Shloka 30 of chapter 3, for instance, Krishna instructs Arjuna, giving up all your actions to me, with your mind on the inner Atman, free from hope and all egoistic notions of me and mine, fight devoid of the fever of the soul. Mayi sarvani karmani sanyasya adhyatma chetasa nirashi nirmamo bhutva yutyasva vigata jvara. The spiritual aspirant should be not only a jnana yogi, intent on realizing the Atman, so adhyatma chetasa, but also a karma yogi who performs selfless works. Mayi sarvani karmani sanyasya. And a bhakti yogi who lovingly dedicates all of these works to the Supreme Lord. Mayi sarvani karmani sanyasya adhyatma chetasa. So whatever you do, do it for me and surrender the fruits of what you do to me. Do everything for me. In other words, the Gita calls on us to practice Vijnana Yoga by striving to emulate the ideal Vijnani, who, after having realized the impersonal Atman, continues to act selflessly in the world as an instrument of the impersonal personal Purushottam. If any of you are interested in further details, please look at my article, which was published in 2015, Toward a New Hermeneutics of the Bhagavad Gita, Sri Ramakrishna, Sri Aurobindo, and the Secret of Vijnana, published in Philosophy East and West. Thank you very much.
Swami Medhananda, thank you very much for that very illuminating talk. And as we celebrate Sri Aurobindo's 150th birth anniversary, it's a timely reminder for us to really engage with his writings even more deeply and profoundly. We'll open the session to questions. So if you have any questions, please feel free to ask. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much for the most wonderful presentation. So my question is, you made this very clear distinction between Jnana and Vijnana. In one of your earlier talks, you also talk about Sri Ramakrishna's connotation of Vijnana Vedanta, which you did.
Well, just repeat that. I don't think most people heard you. So
all right. Sorry.
And look at them.
All right.
You're a professor at VIT, so pretend that they're your students or something.
Yes, but when a professor has a distinguished speaker behind him, the professor often has to look back as well. Anyway, I listen to you. So my question is, from the transition from the stage of Vijnana, from Jnana to Vijnana, to what extent Sri Aurobindo's interpretation about, the grades of consciousness, a systematic categorization of conscious states, mind, higher mind, human mind, spiritual mind, and supermind. How does that interpretation go into what you just talked about as the special attributes of Vijnana?
Right, thank you. Yeah, that's a nice question. So, what I would say is, this goes back to that standard objection that many scholars lodge against Sri Aurobindo, like Robert Minor, who say that, look, Sri Aurobindo was a yogi, he wrote these massive spiritual tomes explaining the different stages of consciousness, as the ones that Shobhajit just mentioned. And so, what he's asking is, can we find the different gradations of consciousness, maybe between Jnana and Vijnana also, I think present in the Gita, or maybe in Sri Aurobindo's interpretation of the Gita? Is that what you're asking? So if that's what you're asking, I guess the reason that he doesn't bring these things in, first of all, is because he wrote this text fairly early, 1916 and 1920. But the deeper reason, I think, why he doesn't bring in all the different subtle gradations of consciousness that he discusses in The Life Divine and other works, in Savitri, is because he doesn't want to be dismissed as just a kind of subjective mystic interpreting the Gita based on his own spiritual experiences. Do you see what I mean? He's trying to be faithful to the thought structure of the Gita itself. And as far as I can tell, I've read the essays on the Gita several times, and I don't see Sri Aurobindo finding subtle gradations of consciousness, the levels that you're talking about, in the Bhagavad Gita itself. It comes up later, but one thing that's important is that Sri Aurobindo never claimed that the Bhagavad Gita, or even the Upanishads or the Vedas, have a monopoly on all spiritual knowledge. He said that, some of the things I've experienced go beyond what are in the scriptures, and that's perfectly fine. So, I hope that's a short answer to your question. Thank you. Devdik, why don't you call in?
Yes.
Yes.
You can just tell me the question.
So I had a question about Shankara. You've done a comparative study of what he said, what Shankara said and what Sri Aurobindo said, and this is there all over in Sri Aurobindo's writings and in many other people's writings. So isn't Shankara passé now? Why do we still go back to him and talk? Because there's so many Vaishnava saints that we could have compared with, but we have not. And we always run back to Shankara and then deconstruct him, which I think is... What do you think? Yeah, what do you think?
Yeah, look, I mean, I wish he was passe, but he's not. I mean, it's just go, step outside the Sri Aurobindo Ashram and you'll find he's not passe. He's incredibly mainstream. Incredibly mainstream. His is by far the most popular and influential commentary in the Indian tradition. I mean, Ramanuja doesn't hold a candle to him. I'm not saying in terms of plausibility, I'm saying in terms of sort of popularity, ubiquity. As I said, the Shankarite interpretation of Jnana and Vijnana in the Gita, this idea that Jnana is merely scriptural knowledge, Vijnana is Anubhuti, is the mainstream interpretation of these terms in the Gita, if you ask ordinary people. Outside the Aurobindo Ashram, this might be a self-selecting population, but that's different. I'm talking about, go to Indians in different parts of India, and even in the West now, you'll find that Shankara has tremendous prestige. Intellectual prestige, cultural prestige, spiritual prestige. Just to give you one example, the Madhya Pradesh government is sponsoring a kind of like a 2,000 crore project in Omkareshwar, where they're building a 108-foot statue of Shankara. And they're modeling, have you seen Akshardham in Delhi? Swami Narayan, it's this like almost spiritual amusement park based on the life and teachings of Swami Narayan. They're doing the same thing based on the life and teachings of Shankaracharya, sponsored by the government. So I don't think Shankara is passe. I think that he's incredibly influential. He continues to hold a grip on the Indian spiritual and cultural psyche for some reason. What the reason is, I don't know. But I don't think he's passe. Thank you. I think also Siddhartha had a question too. Yeah. But after her, you can ask. Yeah. So just. Oh, I see. Okay, that's good. Okay. 2 and 1.
So it's in some ways trying to.
Yes, we stop.
I think I can speak loud enough.
Okay.
So it's attempting a reformulation and wanting to check with you if it's accurate. In some sense, it seems like because, at least in the way that he's formulated, Shankaracharya is formulated, his philosophy, not necessarily reflective of his actual experience, but in the way he's formulated his philosophy, he limits himself to the realm of the intellect, which then forces a sense of linearity. So that is why he has to bring in the adhikara devas. It forces a sense of hierarchy. And so would it be fair to say that he really limits his philosophy to what the intellect can wrap its head around? And would that also then be possibly an explanation of why he's not passe? Because it's much easier for people to grapple with something that the intellect can grasp.
Yeah, okay, thank you. I don't think so. I think that Shankara was a great illumined soul, and he realized the non-dual Atma. I don't think you can doubt that. So he didn't just have intellectual knowledge of the Atma, he realized the Atma. But for Sri Aurobindo and for Sri Ramakrishna, that's not the final stage of spiritual experience. There are subsequent spiritual experiences which presumably, even if Shankara may have experienced them, he certainly didn't develop his philosophy on the basis of those other kinds of spiritual experiences. He seemed to ground his entire spiritual philosophy of Advaita Vedanta on the basis of his spiritual realization of non-dual Brahma. So I think it would be unfair to say that he had merely an intellectual understanding. That's not really fair to somebody as great as Shankara. Yeah, but thank you. scholars. I mean, see, the thing is, these traditional pundits are not open to debate usually. Part of the problem in India is that traditional kind of sampradaya learning has become ossified. Because I was at a university for 11 years, and in our Sanskrit department, it's full of these traditionally trained pundits. What happens is these pundits are trained in a particular sampradaya. Most of them, 90% in Shankara Advaita, 10% Madhva Advaita, Ramanuja Vishta Advaita, Vallabha Shuddha Advaita, all the rest, the Bhakti schools of Vedanta and other sampradayas. And the problem is, once you take for granted the truth of one sampradaya, you can't think outside of that framework anymore. It's a heresy. And I've in good faith tried to debate with some of these pundits. It always ends in disaster. Because they're not willing to they don't want to even talk about these issues. They said it's not up for debate. Because Advaita Vedanta is the highest truth. With that as a premise, they then go on to interpret the scriptures. There's no question of defending Advaita against other sampradayas. In fact, just anecdotally, when I first joined at Vivekananda University in 2010, the Vice Chancellor organized a great symposium, which he thought he was very naive at the time. So he brought together pundits representing Madhva's Dvaita Vedanta, Ramanuja's Vishta Dvaita Vedanta, Shankara's Advaita Vedanta, some monks who were talking about Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy and Vivekananda's. And he thought this would be a great melting pot where people will exchange ideas and finally will arrive at some kind of harmonious reconciliation of these different views. And it was a complete disaster. And it very quickly devolved into name calling and anger and red faces, and he said, I'm never going to do this again. Anyway, that's a kind of short answer. Thanks. I think somebody back there had a question, yeah.
Thank you for your beautiful talk. Based on your eclectic study and lifelong study of philosophy, what would you say are your initial thoughts about universal understanding and selfless dharmic violence in context of each other?
Okay, so I guess the question sounds like it's coming from a kind of Amrita Sen kind of perspective, that the Gita is teaching violence or something, and how can that be reconciled with dharma? I think, the thing is, let's go back to World War II. If the US and other countries hadn't intervened, who knows what the world would look like now? If Hitler had taken over, sometimes wars are justified, sometimes killing is justified, and I think that's part of the point of the Bhagavad Gita. Krishna in the early chapter, in chapter 1, he's telling Arjuna, you have a duty to fight, even against your own kith and kin, even against those whom you love, because it's based on dharma. You're on the right side of dharma. And sometimes force is necessary. In this world, in this imperfect world, that's a kind of necessity sometimes. There's no way of avoiding it. We're not in a perfect world. I mean, that's the way I would explain it. Thank you. But I think we can inculcate in children, and I think it's done in the Aurobindo school here that David teaches at and others teach at. is the practical implications of what I'm calling Vijnana Yoga and this Vijnana kind of philosophy, which is try to synthesize the different yogas in your day-to-day life. So that's why I believe in the schools here that they encourage physical activity. They encourage us to, not us, I mean people who are students here, to learn many different languages, engage in arts and crafts. So there's kind of karma yoga, but also to do prayer and other things, that's bhakti yoga. Also engage in study, which is jnana yoga. So this kind of, I think we can, for children, I think it's better to emphasize the practical side of things. And maybe point to the teachings of the mother, because she's usually more accessible than Sri Aurobindo. And regarding the second question, I've gotten this question a lot, especially in India, because Sri Aurobindo's English is so difficult for a lot of Indians whose mother tongue may not be English. And I think that there's a range of difficulty in his prose, and at one extreme, at the extreme of difficulty is Savitri. A little bit more accessible is the Life Divine, but still very, very challenging. And on the other side of the spectrum, I would put his wonderful letters. These are not published in his lifetime, but I think that's Sri Aurobindo at his most accessible. Letters on Yoga, 4 volumes in the complete works. And the nice thing about these letters is that his own followers were asking him very mundane questions about sadhana, about the challenges they face, obstacles in their spiritual life, and he gives very, very practical responses in much more accessible English than in his published works. The only problem with recommending that as the first text is that it's difficult to understand where he's coming from in these letters unless you have some background in his philosophy. So I wouldn't recommend this, it's not a book, but what I recommend is he himself wrote a little essay, I think toward the end of his life, explaining his own philosophy in the third person. So I think it's in volume, somebody here, Richard, if Richard is here, you can tell me, in volume 35 or 36. That one, that little, like his philosophy or something. You know what I'm talking about? It's in the volume where on himself, Sri Aurobindo on himself. And he's got this.
Autobiographical notes, volume 36.
Yeah. It's just like 3 or 4 pages. It was published in a newspaper or something like that. And it's a very succinct explanation of his philosophy. And I think if you start with that and really focus on every sentence, trying to understand what he means, I think that might be the best foundation for moving forward with Sri Aurobindo's writings. Thanks.
Any other questions? Thank you for the talk, sir. Just want to understand how can we bring the interdisciplinarity into this kind of thoughts of bringing peace to the world?
Yeah, how can Sri Aurobindo, is that?
How can we bring the interdisciplinarity into this kind of thoughts and bring it to the world?
Yeah, that's a good question.
How can we bring it?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good question. It's a very difficult question. And it comes, I mean, we're sort of like exiting the realm of philosophy and getting into kind of culture and sociology. And it's you know, why do most people not accept the liberal philosophies of Sri Ramakrishna and Sri Aurobindo and Swami Medhananda, who all taught the harmony of religions, that at the basis of all religions is the same infinite divine, the Purushottama? It's a tricky question, but one aspect of it is something that Vivekananda used to say, which is that when a sadhaka, a spiritual aspirant, goes very deeply into his own or her own practice. So in Hinduism, there's a concept of Ishta Devata, your chosen deity, right? So imagine that I'm a Kali Bhakta. So I'm going very deep into this practice of devotion toward Kali. What happens is, almost as a kind of, it's very natural that what happens is, the more I cultivate bhakti toward Kali, I'll start thinking not as kindly of other deities, even within Hinduism, even if I know in a theoretical way that Krishna is the same as Kali in a different form, but somehow there's this kind of tendency of the human mind. When you go deep, you tend to lose broadness. So that's like maybe a kind of like an empirical psychological suggestion about the nature of the human mind. And what's striking about, so this is something that Vivekananda said about Sri Ramakrishna. He said that he had the depth, the depth of an ocean and the boundlessness, the breadth of the sky. So he had that combination. I think Sri Aurobindo, we can say that about Sri Aurobindo as well. But they're very rare souls who have both that intensity and extensity, both a tremendous depth and a tremendous breadth. What you more often find is people who are very broad tend not to be very deep. So there are people who are kind of they're like spiritual dilettantes who kind of hop from one spiritual tradition to another. Kind of, I'm going to go to a Vipassana retreat this weekend, and then I'm going to do a little Kriya Yoga, and then I'm going to do this and that, and it's kind of a hodgepodge. They don't go deep in anything. And the ones who go deep are the ones who become a little bit fanatical. So that's kind of, it seems to me, the kind of paradox of human nature. Thank you.
Swami Medhananda, thank you very much for your presentation and your answers. And some of you may know or may not know that Maharaj has been coming to Pondicherry for quite a while. He has visited in the past.
Thanks to
his uncle who asked the first question. He had an early introduction to Sri Aurobindo. And you can also find his lectures on YouTube under his name Swami Medhananda, but also Oil Maharaj. And we welcome you once again amongst us whenever you find the time, and we wish you all the best for your next stage at California.
Thank you so much, David. Thank you all for your wonderful questions. ঠিক আছে দেখাবো 12তে Oh yeah.
I just wanted to say hi. I'm Peter Hughes.
Oh, you're Peter. I'm so glad that you came because I wanted to meet you. I was asking Richard yesterday. So thank you again for peer reviewing a few of those chapters that I sent you. And
Yeah, my pleasure.
Yeah.
I was just telling Matri that I think you probably know Aurobindo better than just about anyone around.